competition, but today I'm going to be talking most generally about ethics, as it is one of my areas of expertise. Now, things are going to get rather uncomfortable, so I do apologize. They might get a bit dark. I will try to use my humor to make up for that. But I kind of want to ask generally, and you don't have to, I don't need a show of hands, how many times have people kind of felt uncomfortable with some ethical implications over the last 2 days? There's been some, oh, I don't know. That's kind of where my research starts, going, oof. And unfortunately, there's a history of the oof turning into unfortunate realities. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I'm going to give you a primer in ethics very quickly, unless you've all taken, history or, ethics, science ethics, so you know what the categorical imperative is, you've got deontology down, utilitarianism is easy. Oh, they're scared faces, so I'm gonna say no. Okay. So ethics, we kind of all have an intuitive reaction to that. We kind of have an understanding of what's right and what's wrong, what is good and what's bad. We all know the original trilogy of Star Wars, good. The sequel trilogy, bad. The Universal, I didn't make this up. Okay, but there is actually formalized forms of ethical inquiry. And in space exploration, there is a need for ethical inquiry because of how pervasive and sticky the industry is. So the history of ethics is quite long. Ever since humans could start figuring out talking to each other, we've kind of needed to figure out how to talk to each other well and communicate well. So we've had these categories of ethics. Probably the most familiar and reasonable for all of us to know is this idea of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? So let's say we all have to share a pizza. And I don't know about you, but I like extra cheese on my pizza. But let's say we have a vegan. Is anybody a vegan? Oh, okay. Maybe we do have vegetarians here, though. So let's say we all want pizza, and the vegetarian's like, no meat. Now, what do? Do we get one pizza with meat, and we're like, sorry, there's only one vegetarian here, you're out of luck? Or do we all end up having vegetarian pizza because actually all of us can eat that, and it's just not our preference? So that's actually an ethical inquiry. So then we can come to something like consequentialism, in which space exploration actually uses consequentialism quite often in the justification for the work that gets done. So we can kind of render that down to the ends justify the means. What do we have to do to ensure that the end happens correctly? So there's a starving kid, get the bread, I have to steal the bread, so the stealing of the bread is actually ethical to give to the starving child. And then there is deontology, which says, no, it's actually about the ethical behavior, the action. It's the action itself that's important, and that stays static. So an example of that would be somebody knocks at your front door, come up, they say, hello. They say, I'm here to kill your brother and or sister. Now, depending on how annoyed they were that day, this might not be an ethical issue, but it would be telling the truth. So telling the truth is a concrete ethical thing. So they're there to kill your sibling, but lying is wrong. But killing is also wrong. What do you do? And so the question is lying right or ethical in that moment? So that's another example of a different kind of ethic. And then there's also virtue ethics. And it actually occurred to me today how many rovers and Martian robots are named for ethical virtues. So you have preservation and curiosity and integrity. All of those are actually virtues, and those are characteristics that we can kind of take on to embody and try to make the world a better place through our presence. Okay, that's ethics. It actually gets way more complicated, and that's Western ethics, based in Greek philosophy, Christianity, and the Enlightenment. There are so many others, but we don't have time, and I'm not trained to actually teach about those things. So we have our little cat looking out at all the cool ships at Jupiter. In the future, maybe. Now we get to the bad stuff. Okay, so this man right here, not his normal comrades, we normally see him in pictures at NASA, is Wernher von Braun. He invented the V2 rocket. Now I'm going to get a little bit sticky here. Anybody know where the V2 rockets were first launched towards? Because it wasn't space. London, England. So, Mr. von Braun here, brilliant mind, loves space. He spent his whole life just wanting to go to Mars. That's all. He just wanted to put people on Mars. He wanted to explore space, and that's beautiful and grand. And then when the Nazis were like, hey, we got a space program, but all you have to do is make sure bombs get to London first, he said, okay. And he was willing to do that. And those first V2 rockets were made by slave labor in a concentration camp. That's where it gonna get sticky. And so when it comes to westernized space exploration, what we end up having is this history of very questionable, unethical, downright genocidal happenings that are used to propel us into space. We only got to the moon because we went to London first. And that is uncomfortable, but it's a reality. And it's something that needs to be discussed, because what are we willing to do to go into space? Is the benefit of all humankind with something we might get in space and might do in space really worth what's actually happening? And don't kid yourself into thinking that because that was then and this is now, we don't have concentration camps. I highly encourage you to look up what lithium mining is like and what cobalt mining is like, and what you need those things for in your technologies. So this is where my research is, but we're going to kind of skip over that because what I think is most important about space exploration ethics and what we have right now is discussing it. So I'm going to give you some examples of these things, and you'll kind of like go, okay, yes, I understand that, or I'll have questions, and I think discussing it is much more important than me talking about it. So when I asked on the first day the question about the right to return, it kind of comes from this. So these two guys, I'm sorry I didn't give you a trigger warning, are kind of the billionaires of space. And we all remember in the COVID summer of 2021, them racing to be the first to take people into space. Elon has gone on to say that he wants to put a city on Mars, and if you can't afford the ticket to get there, well, you can just work it off when you get there. We used to call this indentured servitude and company towns. This was not particularly good. Now let's say you're just like, I want to go to space. I'm going to work off my ticket when I get to Mars. You get to Mars, no good food. You don't like it. They don't have cats. You want to come home. But you have that $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 ticket that you have to pay off. Do you get to go home or do you have to stay? That's when the sticky question of rights and the human rights come up. Do you have the right to return to Earth because you're a human, or do you just have to do what the boss man says? What happens if your company goes bankrupt? And let's say, okay, so maybe an astronaut, they'll definitely save, cool superstar, the first person to go up. But what if you're a space plumber? You're just out of a paycheck, out of ride home. Are you still covered by the envoy status, which says that every single country on the face of the planet has to try to rescue you? Or are you exempt because you're actually not important to the system? Ugh. Yeah. See, this is kind of sobering. I do apologize. It gets better, kind of. It's mostly because I try to be funny. Okay, and so in my work, where I actually come from, talking about the conditions of coloniality. Now, anyone ever heard this term before? Or is this new? So colonialism, pretty sure you've all heard, Europe was like, ooh, Africa looks nice. America looks great. Went over, set up administrative bodies, took over, oftentimes enslaved and killed the indigenous populations, took them. The entire world is actually based right now on current modernity. Coloniality actually is what's left over, and that's actually still in power right now. So coloniality is the way in which historical colonialism still impacts the forms of social and political and psychological constructions that we work with. So the idea of the nation state as it functions right now is a colonial leftover. It reinforces colonial hierarchies. The conceptions of what knowledge is and knowledge production, they're based in Enlightenment rationality. They're colonial. Every time we think about what it is that we want to teach or what is taught or what we consider valid knowledge comes through a history, a 500-year history of what's called epistemicide, the murder or destruction of other forms of knowledge to allow for only certain forms of knowledge that reinforce Western hegemony. So a lot of space exploration is actually based on these principles. And one of those very core principles of coloniality is the exploitation of nature. Now, this has a long history in Western thought and Western rationality, because we think, okay, it's nature, we can actually just do whatever we want to it because it's dead. This is actually the very core of Western space exploration. So at the very beginning, before NASA was even NASA, there were several conversations and memos that went around that said, okay, now that we're trying to gain access to space, what do we do with it and how do we use it? And there became what I call the Killian formula, which said the American government was like, well, we want to be able to exploit everything in space for material and political gain. How do we do that? We explore what it is to find out if there's anything we can use, and then we control it. And unfortunately, science and engineering is part of that. Exploration, you're not just exploring for exploring's sake. You're not doing science for science sake. And a lot of times scientists are, and that's absolutely beautiful, and I wish that were just the truth. But that is being done in a context of social and political agendas that are far beyond our control. So while you're doing your science, some politician somewhere is thinking, or unfortunately a businessman or an entrepreneur is saying, how can I gain power and or money from what you're doing? And that actually went into the very core of the creation of NASA, unfortunately. So they said, how do we control, or how do we have space and exploit it? We explore it and then we control it. And there's a reason that the military has actually always been just behind the corner and not always too far behind what civil space has been doing. And earlier today, and I'm sorry, I'm going to correct you on this, not everybody liked Apollo. In fact, when Apollo 11 was launched in 1969, human spaceflight was at its lowest popularity since the creation of the space program. What you're seeing here are actually protests that happened during the Apollo era. And I can't hook my computer up to the Wi-Fi currently, but I was going to show you a clip of an incredible protest song called Whitey on the Moon. If you haven't heard it, I highly suggest you go and see it. And it says, why is it the American government can afford to take humans to the moon, but we don't have health care? Unfortunately, this is still a question Americans ask. Now, that's not to say space exploration is bad. It's not. You're not going to find a bigger space advocate than me. Love space, think it's amazing, have a lot of space tattoos. And that's where this other guy comes in. Anybody know who this is? All right, you need some music history. I don't know who to talk to at the Institute. Music history. That is Sun Ra. Okay, Sun Ra in the 1970s came up with this incredible, incredible album called Space is the Place. If you haven't heard it, which apparently you all haven't, listen to it, watch it. It's actually a cool, like, concept music video. Sun Ra, according to him, said, man, and I'm going to be a little bit like hippie 70s for a second, so please bear with me. Man, Earth sucks. Can't do shit here. Oh, sorry. But space, that's where we can do things. We can be liberated. We can actually get away, screw the man. And his concept was space could actually be the place where we can go and be liberated from the constraints and oppressions of Earth. And it gives us the potential to actually be fully human and fully embrace what it is to experience the universe. And that's fantastic. And so about 2 years after the initial protest song, Whitey on the Moon, comes out, Sun Ra says, yeah, man, like, the whites don't know what they're doing. But guess what? All the rest of us, we can use this as a way of, like, liberating ourselves. So it's an incredible contrast. And I tend to, unfortunately, Gil Scott-Heron and Whitey on the Moon has a point, but I tend to side with Sun Ra. I think there's something about space that has so much potential. And I'm not the only person that does. So this is an incredible art installation from a few years ago by Ringo 23 called Zapatista in Space. Anyone familiar with the Zapatista? No, okay, they're one person. Okay, they're a revolutionary front in southern Mexico that basically recreated the way of living and acting in the world that is incredibly collective, liberatory, and all around groovy. I don't know why I said that. And one of their biggest mottos is, we want a world in which many worlds can fit, meaning that they don't want to all have to live under Western hegemony and the oppressive systems that it is, whether or not that is the gender binary or knowledge being only produced for the consumption of capitalism or, gendered violence. They want a world that is so much better for all of us, and it's going to be different for all of us, and that's why they have this sort of framing. Okay, so this is all a lot, right? And I probably haven't gotten to some of the questions that you'll have, and because I put a PowerPoint together this morning, my actual presentation is under that, which I don't want to show you because I can't spell. But I do want to go back to a couple more of the unethical things that are going on in the world. But before I do that, I'm just going to end with this, not ending, but I'm going to put this slide up. Okay. No, it's not like an app to a Cash App to send me $100, I promise. This actually will take you to what's called the Space Ethics Library. It is a little bit old, but it is a curated collection of all of the work currently being done and has been done on ethics in space from the 1970s up. There's an incredible amount of material. It's no longer being updated because, and some of you might be feeling a bit of this, sometimes this topic can be really uncomfortable and people can get defensive. And so most of the people that were actually involved in the production of the Space Ethics Library have stopped working on space ethics because they've been harassed out of the community. So with that, I do want to continue talking about some of the other ethical issues that go on in the space community that still need addressing. In which there are no answers to, unfortunately. So I talked about von Braun at the very beginning, and we kind of think, okay, we've got that, fine, right? Except for, unfortunately, NASA, and because that's my area of expertise, I can't speak to most other space agencies, does a lot of contracting and produces a lot of information and technologies that end up for dual use, means they get used for weapons of war. And I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but currently, just under $40 billion worth of contracts NASA has are with the state of Israel. That is, according to US Special Committee, using methods consistent with genocide in Gaza at the moment. Not cool. History's not going to like that. Same way we don't like von Braun. Not just that, we also have private companies like SpaceX who have repeatedly put pollutants into the Texas water and have destroyed bird sanctuaries. And these are not me making these things up. These are according to NBC News and other news sources in the US. Later on in this year, if you're interested in this work, we're actually going to have a tribal representative from one of the tribes near the SpaceX launch site in Texas give a talk for a Space Ethics Conference on the experience of indigenous peoples working around SpaceX. And we also have the issues of within SpaceX themselves, where there have been lots of complaints of racial abuse and gendered abuse and harassment. It doesn't stop there. I could go on. I'm so sorry. We also have the issue with Mauna Kea. Now, this you actually might be familiar with. Mauna Kea? Okay. I'm going to send you some syllabi. Okay, so Mauna Kea is a mountain in Hawaii in which there are proposed plans to build a telescope, and many indigenous people in Hawaii are very much against it, not just because the mountain is sacred, but because it is a direct assault on Hawaiian sovereignty. And I don't know what time, oh, we have a good amount of time, cool. I'm not sure how many of you know this, but do you know what Hawaiians celebrate on February 14th that's not Valentine's Day? They celebrate the death of James Cook, the European explorer that ended up colonizing Hawaii. And do you want to know what James Cook talked about in his diaries before leaving on that voyage? How he was a scientist and explorer, and he was not part of the colonial plan because what he was doing was for the benefit of all humankind. And when he got to Hawaii and the indigenous people were like, we don't want this, they ended up murdering him, and they're still dealing with the consequences of colonization to this day. So these are kind of sobering things. They're not fun. Now, I don't want you to think that space and the exploration of space is just icky, because it's not. Space technologies are fundamentally important to us as people, not just for communications, but for the monitoring of climate change, the monitoring of agriculture, search and rescue, GPS. So we all know space has its benefits, and it has its benefits to humanity, but those benefits do not outweigh a lot of the problems that we're actually encountering and continuing to have with space and space technology. Now, we as practitioners oftentimes don't get a choice in what our work does, but we did get a choice in how we speak about it. And we do get a choice in saying, I don't want to be part of this, and oftentimes that doesn't look like arguing with your employer or getting into fights on the internet, never useful. It does say, okay, what kind of person do I want to be right now, and how can I act that out? And what kind of people do we want to be in space in the future? And what does that look like? What do we need to have for rights and relationships in space? So we're not reaffirming these rather unfortunate consequences of the world in which we live. Can we have, or can we produce ideas and mechanisms that stop those sorts of things from happening? And if so, how do we then implement them in the current world system? Because it's not easy, right? We say, well, we need the money. We all have to pay rent, right? And if the company is paying us and we need to pay rent and we have to feed our cats and we have to give our cats diabetic medicine, and sometimes we want to, watch a movie, we have to get paid by somebody. And if all my skills are space skills, then I'm probably going to have to be part of something that maybe isn't the best thing. And so you don't need to feel guilty about that. We're all stuck in this system. But we do have to ask, what can I do? And I'm going to end it here so we can actually start to have discussions about this, because there's just so much to discuss. But I don't want to end on such a pessimistic note. Space is a huge, huge place. Ways of living and being in the world are massive, beautiful, and diverse. Just because it's like this right now doesn't mean that it's always going to be like this. And it hasn't always been like this. And I want to say, space, and going into space, has the potential to change us fundamentally as peoples. And space is such a harsh environment that we're actually going to have to learn how to not take advantage of each other, how to not just be oppressive for oppressive's sake. It's not all about money and power. It's about community and thriving. So how is it that we change what we're doing right now to make sure that the future in space isn't just a reproduction of colonization, but rather an actual different future for humanity? I'm going to end there.